Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our Women's Health Pitch Club. I am pleased to see that once again we have a mix of people who have joined us in the past, as well as people that this is your first time attending a pitch club. We've got a really good lineup of companies focused on the obstetrics side of women's health, and each is going to be bringing better outcomes for the patients. So for those of you that are new to Pitch Club is something that we host every 2 weeks, and we rotate through specialties with the goal of trying to cover as many as we can within the year. And really our hope is that we can stimulate engagement between our startups, our clinicians, and our investors. There's 3 key actions that we really want to accomplish with Pitch Club. We're looking for feedback. The voice of the clinician is super important, and we want to make sure that you are having a voice within technology. So we're looking for you to provide feedback through the question and answer session, asking good questions of the startups, as well as completing the polls that we will be running later about each of the companies. Then second, we want to get these companies exposure. We've got some great innovation coming through with the companies, and we want them to be able to get exposed to not only you, but our broader network. And we will be doing a recording of this event. So if you liked it and want to share it with people, we'll make it available to you. And then finally, education. We want to create an opportunity for everyone to learn about the new and upcoming technology, the entrepreneurial process, and more. So today we've got a little bit different format than usual. We actually have 2 companies that will be first-time presenters. And then we are fortunate to be able to bring back Risk LD, who is an alum from our Pitch Club, and they've got some great updates and progress that they've made already this year with their company that we're going to provide you with an update. And then I'd like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Eisenberg, who is our guest physician tonight, and she'll be hosting the Q&A portion of the event and has also agreed to answer a few questions of mine before we finish the evening. And then just a reminder, we do have a networking session after the main part of the event, and you have the opportunity to continue the conversation with any of our startups, as well as to be able to network with each other. So with that, I am going to introduce our first presenter tonight, Brittany Hawkins, who's the founder and CEO of Elanza Wellness. So Brittany, if you want to go ahead and share your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you.
As you mentioned, I'm Brittany Hawkins, the co-founder of Elanza Wellness. And after undergoing fertility treatment myself and writing a book about it alongside 25 fertility doctors, I know how much fertility coaching can dramatically improve the patient experience and improve clinical care. Despite the explosive growth in assisted reproduction, there are still some significant gaps in care. Firstly, there is no emotional support, which is really unfortunate if you consider that 90% of people undergoing treatment have depression and anxiety. And then on the other side of the coin, there are some really important lifestyle modifications that people are not told about currently that could actually increase success rates by 27%. Now, because of the lack of education and support, studies have shown that 30% of patients drop out of treatment, which accounts for about $3.7 million in lost revenue per doctor per annum. The existing tools focused on fertility are mostly just tracking and Q&A based apps, most of which are not founded in clinical evidence, nor do they integrate with clinical care. So that's why we've created Elanza. Patients receive psychology-driven coaching, data-driven step-by-step insights, and their own fertility coach to help guide them throughout the journey. For clinics, our pilot shows that we can reduce dropout rates by 50%, adding an additional $2 million in revenue per doctor per annum. And by giving patients evidence-based information and insights outside the clinic, we're able to give 12% of that crucial time back to the clinical staff, increasing their throughput. Lastly, by having access to qualified human coaches, we're able to help patients navigate through the most challenging aspects of the journey, keeping them on track and motivated to continue their treatment protocol. So to kick off the journey, each person has a one-on-one onboarding session with their assigned coach. This is really important because it establishes the connection and accountability as well as support with the person in order to drive that long-term engagement and commitment to the program. After this session, the coach then determines the best next steps for that person based on their unique needs. At the beginning of the journey, we really focus on lifestyle and environmental aspects of fertility, which come from the most current body of evidence. These cover off on nutrition, sleep, exercise, environmental toxins to avoid, and more. They are all delivered digitally in the form of daily nudges, diaries, and the use of behavioral economics with things like gamification. This really helps people feel like they're gaining crucial momentum and progressing towards their fertility goals. So once the person has built a foundation of knowledge, they receive weekly check-ins with their coach. This is delivered either through text or voice. These short sessions are really important because the coach can capture really sensitive information, things like if the person has had a miscarriage or potentially a failed cycle. They can also help the coach guide the person onto the next digital module. This is all built around the fundamentals of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very well-established approach for fertility. Then the journey culminates in the empowerment of whole patient care that can actually improve outcomes. For example, a Belgian study with 260 couples starting IVF found that pretreatment nutrition and exercise interventions led to a 27% increase in success rates. But this really only scratches the surface. After conducting our own meta-analysis on the breadth of lifestyle factors, we've developed our own fully integrated approach to improving outcomes. That's why we're in negotiations right now with NYU and Stanford to conduct randomized controlled trials on how our proprietary coaching platform can actually improve the outcome and the experience of fertility care. From the very beginning, we have taken this clinic-centered, evidence-based approach, working with some of the country's top fertility doctors to co-develop this technology platform. Our pre-consultation pilot was distributed via 11 clinics, which validated our hypothesis that digital coaching would reduce attrition rates, with 50% of patients more likely to continue with treatment after participation. Then in June of 2021, we were one of 10 companies selected from a pool of 50,000 applicants to participate in Techstars New York, which is an accelerator program during which we raised $275,000 in pre-seed funding. We're currently focused on launching our full coaching platform, inclusive of asynchronous digital content, as well as the human coaches. This is distributed through our current clinic partners, for which we're charging $85 per person per month. Having this clinical validation will really segue into our employer pilots that we have in place to launch by the end of this year. This also increases our addressable market to about $24 billion. Then throughout this process, we've been in discussions with Anthem to ensure that the platform is in compliance with the CPT code for coaching. So to do this, we have got exactly the right skills and experience to make it happen. Amongst us, we founded 4 companies in mobile, tech, and fertility. Our combined skills in research, marketing, law, fertility, and tech are going to be really crucial in making what is a very cold and clinical process into one of those both more empowering and much more successful. Join us in taking the fear out of fertility.
Dr. Eisenberg, I don't know if you'd like to start off with some questions for Brittany. And again, just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for Brittany, please put them in the Q&A tab, which is right next to the chat.
Yeah, I can get us started with the question. I know there are, many apps out there already that support fertility health, and you talked about, the CBT. Can you just explain a little bit more about how Elanza is different from existing apps? And, do you have any data to suggest it's more effective, or where do you think that kind of differentiation lies?
Well, so there are many apps in the App Store currently that are focused on fertility. They're mostly around, period tracking or kind of tracking the growth of your pregnancy. But we're really taking this kind of both in person with the coaches and then online with digital kind of support approach, which is sort of synchronous and asynchronous. And we found that combination, it really keeps people engaged on a more daily basis. The other thing is that with apps right now, we actually had an app once and scrapped it because we found that there's already this sort of app fatigue. And often when people are going through what is a really challenging emotional process, they're not actively seeking out a specific piece of information within an app. That's why we've taken a sort of multi-platform approach in which they receive, maybe it's a daily nudge via text message, or it's a phone call, a FaceTime with their HIPAA compliant, everything's HIPAA compliant, or maybe it's a voice call with their their coach. It really depends on, what we're trying to achieve and then building it around the user.
And a related question in the Q&A now is just wondering about the lifespan of that coaching relationship, kind of as things get going, and then also if there is a birth or a miscarriage, kind of what happens after those events.
Yeah, I mean your reproductive lifespan is long, right? So we find that people are most in dire need of this sort of coaching when they're actually seeking out, to become pregnant during the sort of fertility process. However, absolutely, we want to expand both backwards and forwards. There's a lot that we can do coaching for things like PCOS, endometriosis, fibroids, but then also continuing exactly as you mentioned into first year of life and beyond.
And another question coming through is, is this really specifically focused around people seeking assisted reproduction, or it sounds like it's versatile enough that you could, support anyone who's seeking fertility. And you mentioned a number of other clinical scenarios. Can you speak to kind of that initial focus?
Yeah, absolutely. We're really, we have a sort of Our initial focus is going to be assisted reproduction. That's mostly because we have really established relationships with clinics already. But this is absolutely something with the employer strategy. It's anyone who's even considering getting pregnant, or maybe they don't even know if they want to be pregnant. A lot of what we're trying to do is empower the person to not only get a baseline level of knowledge around the sort of lifestyle and environmental pieces, and then give them the tools, the emotional support to actually make decisions that work best for them.
Great. As a PCP, I certainly do this kind of thing every day. So I certainly know patients appreciate that support. You mentioned this employer-focused strategy. Can you talk about that strategy as compared to a direct-to-consumer strategy, and relatedly what the revenue model would be?
Yeah, I've launched apps before, and the B2C model is very much, I would call it a spray and pray. It's really hard to gain any true traction when you're talking about just sort of living on the App Store. It's really important for us to have a true clinical background. We want to be a sort of adjunct to your clinical care. We don't want to replace it. We really want to be in support of it. So for us, having that initial go-to-market through clinics and then integration with employers allows us to not only have it paid for by the employer, but it's just a much, much quicker way to get to market with exactly the right target audience at the right time.
Okay, so this would be an employer-sponsored benefit that someone might receive?
Exactly. I should have continued on that. So we're looking at charging roughly $85 per person per month. It's called PEPM, per employee per month, and it would be on a seat usage basis. And what we're actually looking at, we've gotten a ton of interest from employers, specifically because fertility benefits is becoming this really important benefit that actually employees are looking for when they're seeking out new jobs. So there's kind of two tranches that we're looking at. One is if businesses that already offer fertility coverage, that's things like coverage for IVF or egg freezing. But 90% of those people have depression and anxiety. So the actual management of the process, which is where the real impact, comes down to the employer. That's things like absenteeism, presenteeism, and actually acute healthcare needs that usually come in line with depression, anxiety. So that's where we can actually be a sort of addition to their existing fertility benefits. But then on the other side, there's a lot of small to mid-sized businesses that cannot afford the full spectrum of fertility coverage. So we can actually expand far beyond that and give, sort of those small to mid-sized businesses, as well as people who live in what I would call fertility deserts around the US. People who don't have readily available access to fertility clinics or OBGYNs. So we can actually help them manage that process, and that would live, whether or not you have fertility coverage.
So there's a lot of different scenarios where someone could access your content or your coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk more about your intellectual property protections and your approach in that area?
Well, in this area of digital health, it is really hard to have, proper IP coverage. It has a lot to do with, establishing our unique paradigm, which is this, I showed you the chart before, really covering off on environmental, lifestyle, mental health, and emotional. This is our USP. And a lot of it comes down to brand integration and having this unique paradigm.
Okay, and one other question, you mentioned having 11 pilot sites. What have you learned from that about working with fertility clinics and how to integrate more effectively with clinical care and serve those needs?
We learned so much. It was actually a really great experience working with them. We found that, it's behavior change is actually quite simple. The biggest benefit for the least amount of friction in which to get to accomplish that. So we found that making it as turnkey as possible for the clinic, having it be streamlined as basically a link that goes into the onboarding document for the patient before they arrive in the clinic. Anything that doesn't require more training or any sort of extra effort on behalf of the clinic. As I mentioned before, we're trying to help them be more efficient, not actually add more to their workload. So that was really important to understand the nuances of how each clinic works and what that intake process looks like, and even seeing where the challenges might be if we were to do it differently.
I can absolutely second that we cannot handle one more thing in my clinic. So I know if someone wants us to do something, it has to be, absolutely seamless. I see we have one other question about marketing directly to the patient, and if that is a part of the approach. I know we talked about the employer strategy, but if you have any kind of direct marketing in that way.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be offering direct to consumer. We already get quite a few referrals. We've just found that to target our ad dollars towards more, towards relationships that can deem long-term adoption is going to be really beneficial. But absolutely, we want it to be as readily available to absolutely everyone.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Excellent questions from the audience, and thank you, Brittany. If you have additional questions, Brittany will have a table in the networking session after, so you're welcome to continue the dialogue with her. But I'm going to go ahead now and move us on to Dr. Evan Nadler from Adipomics. And so, Dr. Nadler, if you want to share your screen and tell everyone about Adipomics.
Thanks, Jennifer. So thank you for the opportunity. My name is Evan Nadler, and I'm a pediatric surgeon scientist at Children's National Hospital here in Washington, D.C., where me and my co-founder and research partner, Rob Freistadt, started Adipomics, which aims to unlock the potential of the adipocyte. With respect to this particular pitch, the fundamental issue is that third trimester gestational diabetes testing is too late. Why is that so? Well, we do testing at 24 to 28 weeks for gestational diabetes, mostly because we can. The oral glucose tolerance test hasn't been changed in over 70 years. And if anyone on the meeting has actually taken that test, you know, you drink some awful liquid, you sit there in the office for a couple hours with an IV in your arm, and you get a couple blood tests. And the whole experience is not particularly great. Not only that, it doesn't actually address the real problem or the entire problem of gestational diabetes, which is the intergenerational or transgenerational passage of obesity and diabetes to the fetus. So sorting that out, making it simpler. In a pregnant mother, we're doing a test in the 3rd trimester to make a diagnosis of gestational diabetes, where the injury to the fetus is actually in the 1st trimester. So we're completely missing the boat. We all know that gestational diabetes leads to maternal diabetes and big babies, but it also leads to childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes in childhood and adolescence. So the current paradigm is unworkable. So what's our solution, or why are we so smart? Because I'm sitting in a closet, that's why I'm so smart. What we've determined back in 2015 through our research efforts, and I should say that Rob and I were just your basic, ordinary, basic scientists working in a collaboration trying to understand disease. And what we found is that fat cells, or adipose tissue, can excrete these small extracellular vesicles, also known as exosomes, that carry genetic information through the circulation to all the distant organs throughout the body. And in these exosomes, or these transport vehicles, the microRNAs actually turn on the pathways in the end organs that cause disease. We started with isolating these fragments from fat tissue, but now we can do it in both blood and urine. And actually, urine turns out to be the greatest yield of adipocyte-derived exosomes, even better than blood. So we aim to replace the current OGTT, an awful test with multiple blood draws, with a urine-based test, which will be a reference lab-based assay to detect the disease predicting microRNA signatures, which in the end will lead to earlier intervention using Elanza Wellness, hopefully. This is true for any disease, by the way. We're talking about gestational diabetes today, but we actually have identified a core panel of microRNAs that just show that your fat is misbehaving or sick. And it turns out that around this core, there are also secondary microRNAs that sort of dictate whether you get fatty liver disease from your sick fat, or diabetes from your sick fat, or actually even atherosclerosis from your sick fat. We can talk about that later. So in terms of the gestational diabetes panel, we've identified about 18 microRNAs from adipocyte-derived exosomes found in the maternal blood of mothers, pregnant moms, at 28 weeks gestation. And these microRNAs are not only upregulated in patients with gestational diabetes, but also drive abnormal cardiometabolic development in the fetus. So again, sort of to try to boil it down, nuts and bolts, these are the microRNAs that turn on the pathways that cause these diseases. So as I mentioned before, the adipocyte-derived exosomes are actually easier to extract and found in greater numbers in urine. And most patients don't mind giving multiple urine samples. So we envision a series of tests over the lifespan of the pregnancy where we can monitor progression of the intervention. And we're working on our 8-week data currently, as our first panel was created based on the 28-week data. And the science here is patent protected, with the patent you see listed and a couple other that are also pending, not shown here. So this is just one example of the kind of work that we're doing. And what this is a KEGG graph or a KEGG diagram. And if you pay specific attention to mere 4649 3P. You don't have to remember that one. It's not, it's not important other than to say, to illustrate this point. May or may not be part of our secret sauce, but I'm not telling you. What you see with those big red dots is that the red shows that this particular microRNA is statistically significantly different than in patients without gestational diabetes. And it impacts the signaling pathways that the arrow points to, which are all stem cell related pathways. So the implications of what's going on here are far greater actually than gestational diabetes. But this is just an example. So our timeline. So as I briefly mentioned before, we started as basic scientists working in a lab. And it was when we found that we could isolate these adipocyte-specific derived exosomes from urine that we realized that there was a company in the making. Our first success was winning the NSET2 University Startup Demo Day back in 2016. And then we actually became a JLabs company in 2017 once we really understood the importance of our findings. 2019, we got a grant from the NIH and the Fogarty International Center that actually is the basis for all these data, which is, you see the name of it there. And if anybody wants to discuss the thin fat Indian baby paradox, we can do that in the session afterwards. It's a very complicated clinical scenario where the babies are born with low birth weight but high adiposity. And then, I think we all recognize that particular logo of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So everything stopped in 2019. We weren't allowed to do any research at our hospital that wasn't COVID related. So we actually pivoted and formed a JV to create a SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic that actually is about to undergo its our testing for our FDA submission, which we hope to exit soon, and then use those funds to funnel back into our core business, which is Adipomics. We moved to the new JLab site here in DC up at the old Walter Reed Medical Center. And in 2022 and moving forward, not only are we going to confirm our gene signature and roll out our diagnostic, hopefully in the next 2 years, but we're also working on therapeutic options where we use the power of the exosome to overcome some of the known difficulties of lipid nanoparticle administration of drugs and genes. Again, we can talk about that later. This is our management team. Rob is the brains. I'm the looks. We got Keith and Tom, who are our business strategists and helping us bring it to market. And then our mentor, Eric Hoffman, who is president and CEO of his own company, Reveragen, which is doing its own good business with steroids or steroid-related medications. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I was wondering, can you help me connect the dots with kind of the immediate implications for clinical care once you have this fully developed? Like, how do you see this used?
Sure. So going back to the sort of initial paradigm, by the time you make the diagnosis of gestational diabetes, the cat's already out of the bag. Your fetus is already genetically imprinted, and the risk of childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes in childhood or adolescence is already well past. So our aim is to make the diagnosis, or at least predict the diagnosis, much earlier during organ development, so in the 8-week range. And then you can intervene with, be it lifestyle, be it medications, be it apps, whatever you choose to intervene in with. And then you can monitor with a serial urine-based test, let's say monthly, to see if your expression of the microRNAs is moving in the right direction or the wrong direction, and then pivot accordingly. So basically, we're just trying to, and this works actually for all the diagnoses we're tackling. The aim is for earlier intervention. The aim is to detect plaque disease in your arteries before your cholesterol is 400, not after you get the blood test and make that diagnosis. We want to tell you when you're depositing plaque long before your blood tests are abnormal. And the cases here in gestational diabetes, we're going to tell you that you are trending towards gestational diabetes, 20 weeks earlier than the standard of care, the current standard of care.
I see. So maybe you start metformin, maybe you have an exercise program.
We're not going to certainly dictate the intervention. That'll be up to the practitioners, but at least we're giving the information to both the patient, the pregnant mom, and the practitioner much earlier than they would normally get it.
So kind of a risk profile, like you're not diagnosing gestational diabetes, but you're saying this person is high, medium, low risk for gestational.
We're diagnosing sick fat, and that sick fat is bad, is a sort of, is known, sort of. So we are diagnosing microRNA changes in your fat. So there is a diagnosis, but those microRNA changes predict disease, predict overt disease later on.
Let's see. We have a question about whether you think this technology could similarly be used to predict risk of preeclampsia. I don't know if that's an application you've thought of.
The answer is probably yes, that it could, although, I'm a pediatric surgeon and Rob is a ER doc by medical training, and we're both NIH researchers by night. So neither one of us, can I say, is an expert in preeclampsia, but it certainly can predict hypertension, and it certainly can predict cardiovascular disease. So I would think it probably could do the same. If there's anybody out there who has a big cohort of patients that wants to give us some samples, we're happy to look into it.
That's a related question, is whether you have an OBGYN on your advisory board or some other connection, because those seem like those immediate implications where the outcome comes in, at least, some portion of the outcome can come relatively soon with a birth. So,
sure. So the short answer is no. The long answer is that Rob and I started this journey looking at, type 2 diabetes, just regular old adult type 2 diabetes. And it wasn't until our NIH grant with partners in India where we started looking at gestational diabetes. So it's somewhat of and like I said, we have we've shown changes in the respiratory system, the liver, diabetes, and the heart. So we need to build out our advisory board, and certainly be happy to discuss that with folks offline. But again, the paradigm is sort of earlier. The paradigm is personalized medicine, because we're looking at your particular adipocyte exosomes and disease prediction. How is your sick fat going to affect you? And then what can we do earlier to try to prevent that from happening?
Dr. Eisenberg, we've got time for one more question. So if you want to pick from the group.
Sure. Let's see. So I guess kind of a more technical question is just how are you detecting these exosomes? Like, is this a PCR type diagnostic? And apologies for a lack of technical understanding.
Sure. No, so so there are lots of exosome isolation companies, and I think there was one on Pitch Club a couple weeks ago. And so exosomes are hot now, and people are all over this field. And so what we do differently is, one is we specifically select out the adipocyte exosomes. So we're selecting signal out of the noise. And then the characterization is just gene chip, regular old microRNA detection. Eventually, we'll put this on a card, and we're having discussions with a couple folks who can do this, where it'll be like a colorimetric assay where the card changes color. The 8 genes or 10 genes or whatever the number is change color, and then you get if 5 out of 8 change color, it means your risk is 70%. If 8 out of 8 change color, your risk is 100%. And if 0 out of 8 change color, your risk is 0.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both. And obviously, there's opportunity. If any OBGYNs in the audience are interested in the advisory board, you can talk to Dr. Nadler after, but also we will be sending out a follow-up email, and I can provide the contact information for Dr. Nadler so that if you're interested, you have an opportunity to reach out to him offline as well. So now we actually have an opportunity. We are going to be posting actually just now in the chat, there is a link to a poll where you can provide feedback both to Brittany and to Dr. Nadler on their presentations and their company. And we ask that you please, it doesn't take very long, but if you can just take a minute and go in and give them your perspective. This is really valuable for them. It's a big part of the reason that they do this is to get your input from both the questions that you asked as well as the feedback in the polls. And while you are doing that, we are going to show you a video from RiskLD, giving you an update on some of the progress that they've made.
And why don't we go ahead and start with you giving a little overview of what RiskLD is, and then we'd love to dive into those exciting updates as well.
Absolutely. And thank you, Katie, and the entire AngelMD community for having us back. As Katie mentions, my name is Steve Porter. I'm a practicing obstetrician gynecologist. I'm also the CEO of RiskLD. RiskLD is a software platform that fully integrates with the inpatient electronic medical record, and it provides a combination of early warning or early alerting and clinical decision support at the point of care on labor and delivery. So the whole mission of the software, the mission of the company, is to improve perinatal outcomes, to improve outcomes for laboring moms and their babies when they are in the hospital for that inpatient episode of care at the time of labor and delivery.
That's exciting. And from what I recall, you guys actually have some pretty good data on how you're doing just that, improving those outcomes, correct?
That's exactly right. So our software is based on a series of clinical practice guidelines, essentially standardized obstetric care protocols that have been in place at a large hospital system in Northeast Ohio for the past 10 years. What that hospital system has seen is, since they introduced these standardized care protocols, they've seen a pretty dramatic 92% reduction in serious safety events for moms and babies. And they've also seen a 93% reduction in obstetric litigation costs, which for a self-insured health system is incredibly important. But of course, as physicians, we care about better outcomes for moms and babies.
Well, give us some insights into what's been happening with RiskLD. I've heard there's some exciting stuff on the horizon. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So a couple of exciting updates. So our software is now an approved application in Epic's App Store, the App Orchard, which means it is available for download today by any hospital that runs on the Epic platform. And the technology that Epic uses to support its App Store is a technology called Smart on Fire. Which I don't need to get into the details of what Smart on Fire is, but what it means is that for a hospital to install our application ends up being a 3 to 6 week process of downloading and configuration, as opposed to a 6 to 12 month process of installing a brand new software at a hospital. So the process is incredibly streamlined and not overwhelming for hospital IT departments. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have our first 2 customers on the horizon. So I should mention that the software has been running at a large system in Northeast Ohio from which we spun out, although it is not running on that Epic App Store-based Smart on Fire platform. So we are about to go live with our first 2 customers on that Epic App Store model. The first is a safety net hospital in the East Bay of San Francisco. They were called Contra Costa Regional Medical Center. I'm happy to report that we went up in their test environment last week, hot off the press, and the software is looking great. So we are tracking for an October go live and preparing to train the clinicians to start using the software. So they will be our first real client. The second client with whom we're in contracting at the moment is a large system in northern New Jersey. So they're likely to be a second. And then there's a third system outside of Baltimore that we're also in advanced discussions with. So all very exciting. That was really our goal for this year, to go live at 2 to 3 beta sites. And we are on track to do that. The last piece that I wanted to mention is we've been working very closely with the federal government to advance legislation that's going to make it easier for hospitals to adopt software platforms like ours. And that's incredibly important because Medicaid, the federal government, already pays for 43% of births in the United States. So getting these demonstration sites up and running and supported by the federal government through this legislation will actually provide a platform for national scale up. So we're incredibly excited.
Dr. Porter, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and giving us all these amazing updates for Risk LD. And as I mentioned, we're going to have you back because I want to hear how things progress.
We would love that. It's certainly been an exciting year, and I really do feel like the best is yet to come. So thank you, and to all the AngelMD community. We're thrilled to be part of this network and to be sharing our journey with you.
I know I thanked you earlier, and we've had the opportunity to have Dr. Eisenberg interacting with us tonight. But just to give you all a little bit of background, Dr. Eisenberg's a family physician and epidemiologist, practicing in Rochester, New York. She trained at the University of Rochester, where she completed the MD PhD program and a family medicine residency. And because that's not enough, she went on and last year she received a board certification in clinical informatics. She's very interested in population health, value-based care, analytics, and informatics in addition to her clinical practice. And this year she became a member and actually a co-chair for one of our clinical advisory boards. So we're very pleased to have you joining us tonight, Dr. Eisenberg. So first, I called out that you are a member of our clinical advisory board. And so maybe, do you mind just taking a minute and sharing with everyone kind of what has made you interested in getting involved with AngelMD?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I have a lot of non-clinical, like clinically related interests. And so when I finished my training, I started working in leadership roles and population health roles, at my academic center. And I, was really, I guess it wasn't shocking, but the pace of change was very slow at a time when everything else seems like it's changing very quickly, kind of in society and technology and what's possible in healthcare. So I started just looking around and saying, gosh, I like a bit of a faster pace than what I see around me. So started looking around at, where I might have opportunity to be involved with more new ideas, more innovative ideas, and some kind of faster moving types of ideas. And I can't remember, I initially got on a mailing list for AngelMD, but when I, saw some of the stuff coming through, I was like, oh, they're bringing together a lot of these types of trends that are happening. I really see that this is where things are headed. I really see the value in this type of approach. So I just felt like that approach that AngelMD is taking really lines up with my observations about, where I see kind of the confluence of a lot of trends right now in tech and health and that type of thing.
That's great. Well, and we're certainly pleased to have you be a part of the leadership organization. So, a question. So, I did mention you got board certified in medical informatics, and this is a relatively new area, as I understand it. So, given what you just said, I'm sure that's part of it, that you want to be where change is happening. But maybe tell us a little bit more what got you engaged in informatics.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. So my PhD is in epidemiology, and I've always really loved that kind of number crunching data analysis approach. And I had this really funny experience in some of my leadership roles, and this was pre-pandemic, where a lot of the folks I was working with in the health system did not understand kind of that epidemiology side of my background. And so when I would kind of have ideas from that perspective rather than just my kind of clinical care perspective, I felt like, it was a little bit challenging for people to understand where that was coming from. And when I started learning about the field of clinical informatics, which in some ways has been around a long time with some of the earliest EHRs, and I've met in the course of this a lot of physicians who were like, oh yeah, I was there where we, pulled together our own backroom solution. So there's definitely a hardcore crew that's been around a long time, but as a broader field, as you said, it's newer. And I realized, I had done, by virtue of working in population health, I really wanted to get to the data. And in order to do that, there was so much infrastructure to build. So I ended up just being placed in more of an IT clinician type role because a lot of folks didn't really differentiate between those things. And so I actually found that the idea of clinical informatics and bringing a little bit more of that IT focus and kind of multidisciplinary focus was a little bit more accessible to a lot of the different types of teams I was working with. And I realized, based on the work I had done, that I had fulfilled those grandfathered requirements, this being a newer field. If you'd worked in the field enough, you could qualify to take the board exam. So it was kind of this funny winding pathway where I realized this was a field that I would qualify, and that, as a qualification, that I thought that might help some of the folks I was working with understand my background and my qualifications better, which, really has been true, which has been interesting for me.
That's excellent. It's funny, right? Like, you've been doing it, but now they're recognizing it. So
yeah. And
great.
now everyone knows what epidemiology is.
I know, I was going to say, well, I'm sure last year really changed on the perception.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great. Well, I know that you've been doing some work with Dynamed, which is creating some decision support tools for physicians. And so would love to goodness gracious, I can't speak tonight. Would love to know more about Dynamed, how you got involved, and what you've been doing with them.
Sure. So for those of you who use UpToDate and aren't familiar with Dynamed, Dynamed considers itself an UpToDate competitor. They produce similar content of, topics that you might look up, at the point of care or after a session to access clinical information. So I have a practice of patients. I have about 1,000 patients that I'm a PCP for. And then with the other part of my time, I work with Dynamed, and it's a little startup group within the company that was really working on more cutting edge decision support tools. So things that will be EHR integrated. They started out doing a lot of calculators, like if you're familiar with the cardiovascular risk calculators, they have a number of those style calculators that they've built. And then we've started to expand from there to more algorithms and other clinical information that a clinician might want, in real time as they're seeing patients. And, as a family physician, I am really trying to build things that I would want, things that I would know to be useful. I again got involved with them when I started looking around for more of that kind of early stage innovation type work. They had just acquired 2 companies doing decision support work and combined them into this small group. So I had the opportunity to interview to be, one of the first physician leaders within that group. And I was excited because that's exactly what I was looking for, that being a part of something early, fast moving, and new like that. So that's been exciting. The product itself, I worked on it for about a year, and then we just launched it a few months ago. So that was really fun to see that going through like that, from kind of an earlier stage to something we're putting out there. And then we're getting feedback from the sales team that It's been really well received. And I think that's the nice part about working within a startup group within a bigger organization is there is a sales team that's completely separate, and they kind of handle a lot of that lifting. And, I feel like I can really focus on developing the content that I want to develop and, thinking about what the tools should look like in the future.
Absolutely. I have to admit, I loved when I worked at Amazon. I was a small business and they had lots of outside support. So my understanding is they actually have a product related to women's health. Would you want to do a brief demo, maybe allow everyone to get a better sense of what Dynamed's doing?
Yeah, let me see if I can pull this up.
I can see your screen.
Okay, great. So these are common calculators used to calculate a woman's risk of breast cancer. And in this case, geared towards supporting a shared decision-making conversation about whether to get a mammogram or how often to get a mammogram. So I know these, certainly these are widely available types of tools and information, but I think what is behind this is really powerful, and we're really able to take it up a notch from what you might search out online, or what might be possible in terms of personalization with EHR integration. So I'll just put in some numbers to fill out some of these boxes here. And what we can do is we can design, in this case we're reflecting these specific tools, but we can design these inputs to be whatever we want them to say. So that has turned out to be very flexible, and we've ended up designing, a lot of tools just for topics that, I might say, I think we need this. I think this would be interesting as a PCP. I think this would be important. And then trying to keep this as simple as possible, a little bit of intro information up here. And then with these little info buttons, we can add information to help people understand more detail about what they might put into a given field, or understand how to use a certain part of the calculator. So you put in your information on this page, you proceed, and then it gives you the predicted risk. So runs the selected calculator behind the scenes in comparison to an average risk woman. So this person's predicted risk over the next 10 years would be higher than average, and then pulls in some guidance specific to the information that has been put in. So then there's information. The Dynamed decision section is curated information that our team has put together. Then because this is an area where there can be a number of different guidelines, and sometimes those guidelines aren't exactly the same, we've pulled in what the different guidelines would say in the specific clinical scenario presented here. And in addition, you can get a chart note sharing just a very succinct version of the information output from the calculator. We wanted to keep it something that could generically be copied and pasted and useful in a note, knowing, not every physician would want the same thing pulled in, or you don't want to kind of presume more than the very basics of what the tool has recommended. And then, so a lot of our tools, that's kind of the extent of it, but for some of the tools we have the ability to, for the right topic, put even more detailed information. So we have more of a visual risk here. So in this case, you can switch between no screening if you got screened every year, every 2 years, and again, all specific to the clinical information that was input at the beginning. This shows that, if you don't get any screening, this is what happens. This is how many people die of breast cancer, less than 1 out of 100. 3 would survive breast cancer, kind of regardless of what happens screening wise. In 97, there would be no breast cancer found. And then you can compare that to some more complex situations. If you get mammography, It includes, we don't have to go through every detail here, but some different scenarios about what happens with or without screening. And then the other piece of the group is creating these grids that support shared decision making that succinctly and at I believe we aim for a 6th grade reading level, go through the different options, compare the different options, do a rigorous evidence review to report what we know from the data about each option and compare them side by side. And I believe you can select some of the grids have many more options than this, so you can pick and choose which ones get display. They talk about benefits and harms, and these questions are specific to the topic, so they can be altered depending on what's appropriate for a given topic. So you can imagine a screening question might look very different than how should I treat my knee osteoarthritis. So
this is great. And I have to say, as a patient, sometimes I feel like the information is so generic that I don't really know what to do with it, where this provides, more perspective relative to their specific scenario. Again, we just thank everyone for your time tonight and joining us. And Dr. Nadler and Brittany, we thank you so much for the time that you guys put together to put your presentations together. And Dr. Eisenberg, thank you for moderating all of the Q&A and for sharing a little bit more about your experience and some great things you're doing with Dynamed. So thank you guys for your time and have a good night.